G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of FinChats. My name is Hugh,
My name is Hoi.
and today we'll delve into China's economic growth story, which has slowed down recently. In the first half of the year, China's economic growth has been at 5.5%. However, the Chinese government has targeted a much lower rate of 5%. And this has contrasted quite starkly to its double-digit growth rates of the 2010 periods. And I think there are a few key reasons that are pointing towards a much more challenged economy within China. The first one being property. There has been a deleveraging campaign that has been initiated by the Chinese government. We've had structural issues with Chinese demographics and their population, but also the consumer is challenged on the demand side of the economy. So maybe, Hoi, I just want to get your thoughts on these three big factors that a lot of market participants and economists are pointing towards to. Perhaps we could touch upon like the property story or any of those other factors that you think are weighing down on sentiment in China.
Well, I think by far the biggest issue that China's economy is facing is what's happening in the property market. Just to give you a sense of how important the property market is, in 2020, around about 59%, almost 60% of household wealth was tied up in property. And so what that meant was that you saw a lot of property developers get on board with all that and started to build apartments and over leverage. So they kept building and they kept borrowing. And then once interest rate started to rise, you saw that they could no longer repay their debts. And two of the largest companies, two of the largest property developers in Evergrande and as well as Country Garden can't pay the debts anymore. So what does that mean? It means that they can't build the apartments that they've already sold. And people are understandably upset. But apart from the end investor or the people who actually bought into that, is actually affecting market confidence. And and rightly so, because people, or investors at least, don't get confidence if some of your largest companies out there can't pay your debts because they've actually grown too fast and they've taken on a lot more debt. And the rising interest rate environment all over the world doesn't help with that as well. And you mentioned the demographics, as well as to a certain extent, um, the demographics variable is a long-term variable. But there are so what I mean by that is that China is creeping up towards a aging population, and that will affect the labor market down the track. But more immediate problem is the youth unemployment, which is quite high at around about 21%, I believe. So that's 1 in 5 people between 16 to 24 that don't have a job. And what it means for the productivity of China's economy is that you can't, well, think about it this way: you can't have 1 in 5 people out of work. And these are the younger and theoretically more productive, should be more productive people in the economy. So you have all these issues that are combining with each other to actually negatively impact China's economy, and so much so that they recently downgraded their GDP forecast for the full year to from around about 5.5% in the first half of 2023 to, they say, quote unquote, around about 5%. We'll see whether that's still 5% or whether it's 4.8, 4.7, 4.9%.
I think it's interesting because you can sort of view these factors, I guess, in terms of a short term and medium/long term. trends or effects. So, I think the more immediate term problem is obviously the amount of debt in the Chinese system, because when rates were so low, these developers were taking on excessive leverage in order to build these houses and sell the dream to aspiring property owners that they could create wealth. With an interesting aspect of China's economy, or I guess investments, is that the opportunity pool for our Chinese citizens is quite limited. The Chinese stock market, although large, is quite biased to a few certain industries. The ability to access foreign stocks as well is quite difficult. So, property is one major aspect that Chinese people can create wealth. And to your point, like that accounts for 70% of their wealth and a third of GDP. So any impact or negative sentiment on property will weigh down on Chinese GDP and economy, which is what we're seeing now. And I think more long term, you got to think about what structural issues they have, which again you pointed to on the makeup of the population. So they have an aging population, but I guess more worrying is that youth unemployment rate, which has just skyrocketed, to 1 in 5, which is insane. I think just more on that is that there's a mismatch of skills. Particularly, a lot of these college students were studying more social sciences, business, economics, and finance, but the Chinese government actually needs skills more in STEM and semiconductor engineering and technicians and whatnot. So there are major compounding factors, and I think what's interesting is that the Chinese government hasn't really had a well thought out policy response to this. Do they
Well,
short term liquidity, or do they address the structural factors? So,
yeah.
what are your thoughts on how they address these compounding issues? For
Yeah, it's a good point. It goes to the question about, well, okay, you've got these issues. What are you going to do about it? And you're right that there's a number of the market in general has sort of commented that the policy response from the government, from the regulators, has been more timid this time than, say, when the financial crisis hit back in 2008, 2009. And it's kind of a cycle once you understand why, because back in, say, the financial crisis back in 2008, what the government did was, pump in a lot of spending through infrastructure, building roads, hospitals, etc. And what that did was they lifted the economy out of a possible recession, and was one of the first economies to get out of a slump. And that's because they injected, if I remember rightly, over 4 trillion renminbi, or 4 trillion yuan, the Chinese currency, which is around about 586 billion US dollars. But then, but what has happened then is that um, when you are injecting that much money, it's not like they have that money on the side in cash. They borrow that money to finance those infrastructure projects, and the local governments now are still saddled with a lot of debt that they're still sort of trying to repay and still struggling with. So when you fast forward to 2023, when you have local governments, etc., being overburdened with debt, you can't really apply the same policy response and just build more infrastructure and take on more debt, because it is debt that is, making the economy tank a little. So that's why we've seen a different response, a more timid response this time around, because some people are calling for more, monetary policy responses, and that will have impact to, the renminbi currency exchange rates, good and bad. And then, but some people say, look, you need to have structural reforms. The economy can't continue to thrive just purely on government spending and infrastructure. It needs to come from consumer demand. So the question then for those side of the way of thinking is, how do we increase uh, consumer spending, business confidence, as well as attract more investor funds. And that's what's lacking at the moment. So we'll see what they come up with. But um, that's why we can't, well, that's why they can't, the government, the Chinese government can't simply just replicate what they did, a few years ago.
Yeah, they need to have a new sort of business model per se. Sorry, an economic growth model. You can't rely on that old infrastructure building sort of system where you're pumping out projects and buildings and whatnot. I think for me personally, and most countries, is that productivity is the major long-term growth engine, because you come to a point where an economy will reach their, I guess, full capacity, which is where you will utilize all the resources that you've got. And the only way to increase more output for a given input is that sort of productivity piece. So I think that's something to look into. But I just wanted to move on more towards the ramifications that this story has, I guess, just not only for China, but the world, because the Chinese property sector is also a gauge for the Chinese economy more broadly, as we've discussed, in the terms that it has upstream and downstream effects. And what I mean by that is that on the upstream side, it affects the commodity side, suppliers, and anything involved on the materials side of things. So think of countries like Australia that are exporting iron ore to China to build steel mills and whatnot, so they can construct these buildings. But downstream, you think about the Chinese consumer. When they buy a house, they've got to buy household appliances, TVs, etc. And also the value of those properties affects wealth. And if you have declining wealth, it affects confidence and then the propensity to spend. So, yeah, your thoughts on, I guess, who's affected, or how are they affected with this? Yeah.
As the old saying goes, when China sneezes, everyone catches a cold, and that's because that China makes up so much of the world's growth, not just domestic, their domestic growth. So apart from what you've mentioned, there are, because of the sliding confidence, there are areas, especially around Asia, that's picking up that extra opportunity that slipping away from China. So, for example, the Asian markets are capturing more of that opportunity. So, Vietnam, in terms of manufacturing, they're getting more manufacturing opportunities. Singapore, in terms of capital flows, you know, people who, well, mainly investors who may not have the same level of confidence that they had in China just a few months or even a few weeks ago, might be moving away their capital, their money, to different centers now. And so what does that mean then? It means that the renminbi, the Chinese currency, is likely to depreciate. And they are a not exactly a market exchange, a market exchange rate. They do control it, but they can only control it up to a certain point, their currency. So then you've got the added complexity of India rising up in the ranks in terms of their economic growth. Their services, exports in services, is really ramping up. So you've got all these dynamics that sort of are punching the China economy, from all sorts of directions, and it's for them to lose and for the rest of the world to gain. And all this, I guess, boils down to how confident are people in the government's policy response to this economic woes at the moment? And if people are not feeling confident, whether they're professional investors or mum and dad investors or etc., um, we may see more outflows in terms of capital from China to other parts of the world.
Yeah, and I think just one final point to sort of wrap up is that confidence has also fed into geopolitics. There are growing tensions between the US and China in regards to semiconductors, the Chips and Science Act, Taiwan, etc. And I think that what you've seen is a growing trend to nationalism or bringing supply chains onshore. There are a few developments in the US where they're building semiconductor factories in Ohio rather than having that outsourced to other countries. So, that trend will likely see, again, growth weighing down on China. Instead of having your iPhones produced there, you're moving to those Southeast Asian countries, letting them, increase their economic growth. And China's struggling. There are only a few factors that you could cling on to before things don't go your way. But without further ado, thank you for tuning in to this video on everything China. But if you're interested in this type of content, please make sure to click the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment if you had any questions in regards to this. So thanks all.